our Institute for the American Future, sponsor of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, but also the Victory Coalition. Daniel Greenfield is his name. He has been a driving force behind the David Horowitz Freedom Center for years now, and is the successor to David Horowitz, blessed memory, alas, who is, I think, going to become an even more formidable public intellectual and leader on all of the sorts of issues that we're discussing today. We were able to catch him very late to participate in this program, and as always, I'm so appreciative that he has done so without a lot of preparation or forewarning. But he will, of course, bring this tremendous intellect and deep knowledge of all of these subjects to bear in answering the question that we've put to him, which is the way ahead. What is to be done now vis-a-vis Iran and communist China? Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Frank. This is a very impressive gathering of experts, and I'm afraid that I can only add so much to that. But to we sum up some of what we discussed. During this conflict, we had the opportunity, a very perhaps once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, to isolate communist China from its energy supply, and in the process, break up some of what some of the people who have been here, who have been discussing this, David, Dave, others, have been discussing in terms of the alliance between China and Iran, and at the same time really isolate China, because the great challenge has been that China has been trying to work around to build its own world power network, economically, politically, in other ways, and in the process isolate us. Now, that opportunity was unfortunately squandered from it. The same reason that it tends to be squandered in past history is that we have the sense that we can apply some military pressure and move on to a diplomatic solution without fundamentally realizing, particularly in the case of Iran, Islamic terrorists, that diplomacy there is absolutely a dead end. And we are hearing these now proposals for a grand deal with Iran that will move Iran over into our camp. And this was the sort of thing that had been tried with varying degrees of success elsewhere in the Middle East, with Egypt, for example. But Egypt was, at least by the standards of the region, a more secular government. It was a military government, and one that was willing to be pragmatic and not as ideologically driven. That's certainly not the case with Iran, which is fanatically ideologically driven, whose whole impetus is this conviction of an eventual Islamic victory. The sense that their conflicts are with us are tests of faith, which means that predictably Iran is celebrating a victory. Predictably enough, it's not backing down in any way. And also predictably, it's undergone seemingly the worst disaster it's ever experienced, which to us, a lot of people, seems like an astounding victory for us and a massive defeat for Iran. But from their perspective, they've sustained the worst that we can dole out, the worst that Israel can dole out. They're still here. Their damage to them is something that they can rebuild. How much damage has been sustained by the nuclear program, the rebuilding process is being debated now. But the bottom line is, from Iran's perspective, they can bounce back from this. And, you know, when life is cheap, when the economy is controlled by the IRGC and other elements of the regime, they don't really have to worry all that much. Will it be a complete setback for a Western nation? Is not so for a totalitarian dictatorship, which is what Iran is. So China is now looking at this in two ways. We've sent kind of a double-sided message to China. On the one hand, we've sent the message that we are not entirely predictable, that we can strike quite unexpectedly, and that's something that certainly China's leadership will be thinking twice about when they look at Taiwan, because they don't exactly know what we're going to do. They've seen that unexpectedly the United States can pivot and launch a surprise attack, and that's a good thing. It's good for deterrence. But on the other hand, China has reaffirmed its general impression of us, which is frankly not unjustifiable, that we're a paper tiger, that we have no real staying power in the conflict. And that's really been the bed of every anti-American force, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Asia, that's come up against us. Their sense is that we have a great deal of firepower. We have ability to cause catastrophic damage. We can, in theory, destroy much of the world. We don't don't have the morale, we don't have the strength of will to actually move forward with anything. And obviously, this was the calculation, for example, of Hitler, who assumed that we would not be inside the war until 1980. And he was obviously catastrophically wrong. It was the calculation of the Japanese. And we are, at least internally, still the nation that is capable of doing those things in theory. But that is how our enemies tend to see us. And China's impression of us now is that, yes, we're capable of carrying out, in theory, a devastating strike, but we don't really have the staying power for an extended conflict, and they do. No other nation in the world, including China, really thinks that they're stronger than we are. What they believe is that they have a stronger morale, a stronger will than we do. And when we engage in half measures, when we miss opportunities, when we behave in the way that we just behaved, when we start offering up deals, as a practical matter, we are affirming the impression that they should not take us seriously. So how do we move forward? First of all this talk of a grandiose regional deal of an attempt to subsidize China's so-called civilian nuclear program is absolutely a terrible idea. The message that we're sending to China, first of all, is that we are still going to resort to trying to bribe our way out of problems. And that's not the way to impress anybody. Secondly, trying to offer China a civilian nuclear program is a farce because, offer Iran a civilian nuclear program is a farce. Iran's electrical rates are a fraction of what ours are. They get their energy from their massive energy reserves. They don't need nuclear power in order to have a civilian program. Their only purpose for a civilian program is to weaponize it. So if they accept any deal with us, it will be, again, to advance a military, not a civilian nuclear program. And doing that with them is not going to swing Iran over to our camp. Regime change might have made that possible. Any kind of regime change even might have made that possible, but leaving the same infrastructure and power, whether the supreme leader is officially in power or not, as long as the RGC runs things, it is going to be a government that is fundamentally hostile to us, that will negotiate with us, that will make deals with us only to advance their agendas in the short term, which means we cannot go down that road again. Now, before all this happened, before this conflict happened, I said we should have two policies on Iran. Either we deal with Iran seriously or we do not deal with them in any way at all, because half measures are a disaster to our perception as a great power. If we engage in half measures, if we show that we can be manipulated, if we show that what we really want is to make some sort of deal, well, we're not going to get a deal. It's fine to hold out our hands to Europe, to Western nations, nations that we have at least some commonality with, nations that are not inalterably hostile to us. With Iran, we really cannot have any negotiations. We cannot have any meaningful understandings except a balance of power. And on the one hand, we've kind of affirmed the balance of power. On the other hand, once we start offering Iran treats and trying to offer them a deal, we go backward. We undo all the good that we did. We can have a balance of terror with Iran because Iran has a balance of terror with us. And as far as Iran's relationship with China, we should continue to try to isolate China. That said, we should continue to isolate China by building bonds and relationships with countries that are not going to be fundamentally hostile to us. Trying to bring countries that are terrorist in nature into our camp is not going to work. It's actually only going to give our enemies a foothold inside our camp. What we can do is try to economically weaken those countries. If we're not going after them militarily, we can weaken them, and we can actually take the entire question of Iran's oil supply to China seriously. President Trump's statement arguably affirmed what has been already, unfortunately, America's policy toward Iran's oil trade with China, which is what we saw under the Biden administration. The Biden administration simply turned a blind eye to it. President Trump went ahead and said that China can go ahead and continue buying Iranian oil. On the one hand, you can see why this is a mistake. On the other hand, in the way Trump is taking ownership of this, and you could read that as implicitly suggesting that the United States can then choose to cut off that oil if it wants to. And that's something that the administration should explore. We should explore how we can control those oil sales, how we can limit those oil sales, and how we can take that spigot and turn it on and off, not by trying to engage in diplomacy with Iran. We should still do whatever is possible to weaken that regime. And the Trump administration's pressure on Israel to scale down is a mistake. And, forget a thing about whatever alliances we have or don't have with Israel, whatever relationships we do. Let's look at the way Iran handles the situation. Iran has its proxies, its allies, and they continue launching attacks regardless of whatever negotiations Iran has with that country. The United States could use Israel the same way. It could authorize Israel, it could arm Israel, it could give Israel the freedom to attack. and then disavow responsibility for it. And that's a position of strength, really, instead of scrambling to prevent Israel from intervening. So one would hope that the Trump administration will look at this now and say that if Iran does not get on board with a deal that ends its nuclear program entirely and opens it to inspection, that the United States will once again unleash Israel. That is a position of strength that we can take. We should also do whatever we can to continue to economically and politically weaken Iran, while avoiding any the extended diplomatic entanglements. Any deal with Iran should be simple and clear if we choose to make such a deal. If we have a continuing extended negotiations process as we did with the original nuclear deal with Iran, that is a dead end. It's a process by which Iran repeatedly manipulates us, puts us to the ringer, gets the maximum concessions that it can get, while actually giving us nothing. That's what we've seen with the Obama nuclear deal. We should not settle for any nuclear deal that is short of total, absolutely verifiable inspection on the ground, surrender all nuclear materials. Anything short of that is a disaster, and we're not going to get that from Iran. We certainly have not done nearly enough damage to Iran. We have not actually implemented regime change. Without that, we're not going to get any nuclear deal worth having, which means we should not humiliate ourselves by jumping through the hoops of actually even negotiating with Iran. What we can do is make very specific ultimatums. As President Trump said, unconditional surrender. Short of unconditional surrender, we can make ultimatums in very specific areas. And if there is no reaction, then we can unleash Israel. We can unleash some of our other allies who, if they actually knew that we were offering them backing all the way, might be willing to engage in certain kinds of, maybe not military, but political and economic sabotage of Iran. Iran, as we've seen, is actually much weaker, and it raises the possibility that China is much weaker than we anticipate. And that's something that has to be worrying China after seeing what happened with Iran. We've built up these enemies as great threats, and they are, as far as we know, great threats. But as it turns out, when we actually take assertive action, some of those threats can be significantly weaker than we anticipate. That's the lesson we should have, and that's the policy we should have going forward. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you. Well, you packed a lot into that and set the stage very nicely for our finishing Q&A. I did want to just make a general observation, if I could, and perhaps either of you might want to comment on it in connection with our line of questioning that comes from